Welcome into a new edition of the BWI Live Show. I'm Greg Pickle. That's Thomas Frank Carr. It's the September 11th version of the BWI Live Show. Obviously, we're thinking of everyone that was lost and impacted by the terror attacks of September 11th, 23 years ago today. Penn State is in the middle of its, hard to believe, T. Frank, 23 years ago, but certainly thinking of everyone and involved with that. Hard to believe 23 years have gone by since that. Hard to believe Penn State has a week 3 bye week. But it does. The expanded Big Ten and the fact that teams now need to have 2 bye weeks, even with the 9-game conference schedule, means that Penn State, like many other teams, I believe Ohio State also on bye this week, has some time to fix things and correct things and build depth very early in the season, which is uncharacteristic, of course, based on how past schedules have gone. So we're going to get into all of that today. Injury update that James Franklin shared on Tuesday night, and plenty more that we either saw at practice or heard from the 11th year leader of the Nittany Lions inside of Haluba Hall. But T. Frank, before we get too much further into all of that, we're 2 weeks through the Penn State football season, and you were on the channel here on the BWI Live Show on Tuesday with your thoughts. Of course, you also were on the postgame show after Bowling Green as well. But my first question for you, and I think the chat's already getting rolling here, so we'll see if any of that is where we if we get into that. But I guess for you, where do you see this Penn State win now with a few days removed from it? Does it change any of the way you feel about it compared to how you felt on Saturday afternoon?
Yeah, a little bit. I thought, I confirmed some of the things that I thought I saw, and then some of the other things that we'll get into during the film study at the end of the show about maybe the defense or the offense. I don't feel as concerned about anymore because a lot of those were focus issues, I think, for the first half of. James Franklin said it last night. They didn't play well in the first half. Nate and I talked about that yesterday. We thought specifically certain aspects of the defense just were not engaged. And so when you fixed that, the tackling was fixed. And then some of the other issues on the defensive side of the ball, including third down, were also fixed. So were there long-term systemic problems that came out of that game for the defense? Not necessarily. The injury thing is a separate category. But when we talk about on-field play, I think if you're concerned about the pass rush or the tackling or being shredded by the Bowling Green quarterback, some of those issues were not systemic. They weren't like long-term problems. They can come, and any of those things can come up again against better teams, but they weren't. I don't think it exposed some flaw in this team. There were decisions they were making that are more the point than oh no, this team can't cover anymore. Like, that's not the case. Like, there's certain specific things that broke down over this weekend at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com about how they were playing and what sort of effect that has when you face a semi-competent quarterback. And I think that's mostly the situation from this past weekend.
After listening to James Franklin talk after the Bowling Green game at Beaver Stadium, then listening to the defensive players talk after that game at Beaver Stadium, and then listening to James Franklin talk about the defense at Haluba Hall on Tuesday night, I am as convinced now as ever that the point you just made is 100% right. It was an effort and a focus issue by and large in the first half. They did not tackle well. They did not communicate well. And we're going to get into that. I have some thoughts on that whole situation a little bit later in the show. But they did not handle their assignments well. And you saw Bowling Green take advantage of that. And then once they settled down at halftime, they were able to, hold Bowling Green to just 89 yards and I think some kind of an awful mark on third down after a pretty good first half of third down work.
They had like 1 third and short, and to me that was the most important thing. Is they were better on third and long, where they gave up a couple of really bad third and longs that were not. Those were more just guys playing too hard, like pressing a little too much, and then in the second half they had way fewer third and shorts, which were a massive swing in the game for sure.
No doubt. Rob, anyone remember the complaints about a 56-point win last year when Penn State could have beaten Bowling Green by the predicted score and some people would have been happy? Yeah, touche. Fair enough there. Wobble Wobble says they better prove it against Kent State. Then let me tell you something right now. If you thought the performance against Bowling Green was bad for Penn State, if there's anything even remotely resembling that against Kent State, which is one of the worst teams in college football, then Penn State has a lot bigger problems, and we will have a much different tone in 2 Wednesdays compared to today.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's get into the news of the evening as we talk here on Wednesday, September 11th. James Franklin spoke for the only time with reporters Tuesday night during the bye week and revealed what we kind of expected based on what we saw on Saturday, that Andrew Rappleyea, the redshirt freshman tight end who Penn State was expecting to play a lot in 2024, both early in the year and throughout the season, regardless of Khalil Dinkins' status, is out for a extended period of time. A long-term injury is how they are describing this now. If you have not followed along with the way the Penn State injury discussion works, ever since who was it? Zariah Fisher was ruled out for the year and then came back late in the season. Yeah. So now that once that happened, and I think he was like way ahead of schedule, and I do think that's kind of an anomaly, but maybe not. Regardless,
Jackson Smolik is
Jackson
practicing.
Smolik, right?
Yeah.
Right. Which is another one. So
crazy.
Yeah, so I don't think there's going to be anything that Penn State will ever describe anymore as a season-ending injury. It's going to be a long-term injury or will miss extended time, something along those lines. But for Andrew Rappleyea, who was on crutches Saturday on the sideline, James Franklin said after the game his injury was too recent to figure out. It happened on Friday before the Bowling Green game. We learned today, or yesterday, obviously, that it's a long-term one. So, Team Frank, just your initial thoughts on confirming what we expected and what it means for the Penn State tight end room moving forward.
Yeah, so basically they've got 2.5 healthy tight ends right now. Some of the things that we saw yesterday will play into that. Khalil Dinkins is back. He played 8 snaps last week. I don't think that is back, So they're relying now, instead of a redshirt freshman who's gone through the Penn State lifting program twice, 250 pounds more mature player, you've got Luke Reynolds. And I know we track these things, Greg, and you're the best at tracking these things. He's a for sure hard green light at this point because he's going to be playing in his 3rd game in 3 games. So unless, nobody's coming back and nobody's saving that red shirt now at this point.
But you know what?
They need 3 tight ends.
Yeah, and he doesn't need the red shirt. I mean, if you go back and watch the play on Nick Singleton's 41-yard touchdown run to seal the game, he was a part of the blocking group that helped Nick Singleton have a hole that pretty much he was able to run untouched through. And so I think that he is impressively ready to do the dirty work of a tight end in the Penn State offense.
Got the mentality for it. Yeah.
Yes, right. And not every guy comes to campus with that mentality. So, and this is just random, I think, but how about after all the years of talking about Penn State's struggles in the trenches and in blocking and with toughness and with physicality and so on and so forth, they now have 2 freshmen, T. Frank, who come in with the mentality of blockers. Cooper Cousins obviously being one and Luke Reynolds the other. It's pretty interesting.
Good point.
To think back on all the times they didn't have that out of younger guys or older guys.
And for a guy who we kind of compared to Mike Gesicki in terms of his contested catch and leaping and vertical stretch ability, to have that part, I mean, that's exciting for the future. So this is the delicate thing. It was his very first game, but against a Power 4 opponent, he was not as effective as a run blocker as he was against Bowling Green. So that's, I think, the short yardage impact of this is the biggest issue because Andrew Rappleyea, James Franklin has talked about this. We've talked about Andrew Rappleyea's potential as a blocker since he was a senior last year when he committed to Penn State, and we saw how mature physically and from a mentality standpoint he was. So Penn State's blocking got appreciably worse without him, understanding he's also a redshirt freshman and was going to make some mistakes along the way. But the combo of Rappleyea and Warren could have been, by the time you get into October, November, could have been a potent combination because it is about the receiving ability blended with the blocking ability that forces bad situations. Now it's just percentages worse where you've got a freshman and Khalil Dinkins who does not profile as strong of a blocker, although we've been told he's gotten better at those things. Coming off of an injury, during training camp, we have to see where that is. So that's the biggest thing to me. And then short yardage packages. Andy Kotelnicki used 3 tight ends a healthy amount at Kansas over the years. And it's always about what is your personnel, and he'll adapt the system to put whatever the best players are in those positions. But going back to the point of tight ends provide you a passing game threat and a running game threat. So they are the most versatile players you can have on the football field. So if you have to replace one of those guys on the offensive lineman in short yardage, that's something you can do. And I think that's something we even saw last week against Bowling Green. But you're removing one of those threats on short yardage to create potentially explosive plays through the passing game or just the versatility in general. So those sub-package things, I think those are going to take a hit, and maybe Penn State short yardage changes from what the plan probably was this whole time. Because remember, they've been planning this offense with Andrew Rappleyea and Tyler Warren there the whole time. Like, Khalil Dinkins has had his bumps and bruises, but they've been working the ideas and the concepts around having two strong blockers, and now that's a little in question. So I just think that there's some... It happens now when they can make some adjustments, but it is a long-term effect of what this offense is going to be and how effective they can be in any situation.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And I think that... And there's some questions in the chat about this. We can get to them in just a second. But there are some big concerns about depth across a couple position groups on this team. Tight end is now one of them. You know, you thought you would be okay with Khalil Dinkins out because you had Rappleyea. Well, now you need Dinkins to be back and ready to go because you don't have Rappleyea. So, as you mentioned, Luke Reynolds is pretty much certain to burn his red shirt at this point, which was probably, quite frankly, always going to be the case anyway. But you could have envisioned in a world where Dinkins and Rappleyea was healthy. You could envision a world where they got him to a point where they felt like he could play, but still held out on using him. Which no longer looks like it'll be the case.
That was kind of the issue, or the situation last year, where they could have played Rappleyea, but they had two strong tight ends that they played all the time. This year they had three that they really liked. Admittedly, you wanted to play all three as opposed to just playing two a lot. So there was always the world where they could play four tight ends. Now it's down to, like, it's more along the lines of last year where you've got 2.5 right now. So hopefully you get back to 3, and Luke Reynolds provides some of those. He might not be the exact same thing that you were going to get from Rappleyea, but something that's equally impactful from maybe the receiving aspect of everything.
Yeah, no doubt. A couple things from the chat, T. Frank, before we move along. Brad asked, is Jerry Cross a miss at this point, and what about Joey Schlaffer? On Cross, I think, it's probably fair. I mean, he came to Penn State not as a guy like Luke Reynolds or Andrew Rappleyea that was expected to play early and often. So, you know, maybe it's in the next year he develops into something. It certainly does. It's taking a while. And I guess that's sort of the, you know, you could call him a miss. I'm not sure I'm ready to go quite that far yet, but I think it's probably getting close to time to say so.
Well, I was just going to say, like, this was something we were going to talk about in the practice observations, but you got Jerry Cross, who seems to be healthy now, has been leapfrogged by Luke Reynolds. I mean, that's an indication to me of a guy who's physically ready from Jerry Cross's perspective of the size and some of those things that he could provide blocking elements if he were ready. But if you feel like Luke Reynolds is the better option, there are more than physical aspects that you are saying pretty loudly with that decision.
Right. Yep. And kind of the same thing along with Schlaffer as well, who continues to need to add weight, maybe more physical for him.
Yes.
So I think that obviously you look at the skill position player health overall. We talk about the tight ends, but there are question marks at other spots. James Franklin was only asked about Andrew Rappleyea last night, so nothing new on KJ Winston, who was not seen in practice. Nothing new on Tamir Robinson, who was not seen at practice. Otherwise, things look to be pretty much in order in terms of anyone who was maybe banged up against Bowling Green. But
it's also the bye week, right?
Right. So a lot of those guys might be
veteran rest day, sort of.
Right. Yeah, so we'll have to wait and see on that. I mean, obviously, you would like to have both of them for Kent State. I don't know if you need them. If you need them against Kent State, you probably have bigger problems than just the two of them being sidelined in terms of a lot of different things. So, but overall, you know, I think there's a question here. Let me find it. It's kind of goes along this topic. T. Frank, seems like a lot of injuries are occurring more at our star-studded position groups like safety and tight end. How likely is that we start rotating guys in, like DeJuan Lane? So I think, again, if Penn State got to, number one, it was going to play more guys against Bowling Green until it hardly beat Bowling Green. So that's the first thing. James Franklin was asked about that on Tuesday and was kind of just like, we just need to win. Like, we'll worry about that later. Not ideal, but we need to win. So it's a fair point from him. But, yeah, I mean, I think Penn State would like to rotate these guys in some more, but they have to earn it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the hard. At some point, yeah, you might be forced to, either regardless of whether they earned it or not. But that's not always the case. And if you feel like you can get by without forcing guys into roles they may not be ready for, I think you're going to do that.
Yeah, and it comes down to who's playing what position, because Dejan Lane is going to play a safety role. He's not going to be the lion. So if you're down to 3 safeties, or if you're down to 2 safeties, who do you trust more and in what role? Do you trust Dejan Lane to not give up big plays by being fooled by play action, or do you trust Cam Miller to fill in the run game better as the lion, and then you move Jalen Reed back to safety? I know we're talking about the Kent State game. We're not talking necessarily about these against meaningful opponents, but just as the contingency of this is a long-term thing with KJ Winston, or if they lose another guy at certain points, it's as much about what pieces fit together and where can you have your weaknesses and still sustain. And so it's not as much about can you get Dejan Lane into the rotation, it's where does he get into the rotation, because I think that's as important. We talk about this all the time, of it's not just the tight ends versus the tight ends, it's the receiver number 3 versus tight end number 2. And so it's corner number 3 versus safety number 3 or 4. And you got to make those decisions of what you want to get better, because Cam Miller needs to have some reps as that nickel if they plan to use him long term as a third defensive back in that rotation. Same thing with if you want to get Dejan, whichever one develops faster is going to be how it goes from a realistic implementation point, as opposed to what's the theoretical best possible scenario is everyone gets all the reps.
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions piling up about a certain player and a certain position in the chat. We're going to get to that just a little bit. Maybe we'll cover that in practice. One more news and notes thing, James Franklin not providing any additional statement or anything other, as you would expect, about the report that Amin Vanover was arrested on Tuesday and charged with DUI. So he obviously played in the first couple of games. James Franklin was asked if there would be internal punishment for him related to that. He said what you would expect was that we put out a statement and we don't typically get into that stuff beyond that. So time will tell how all of that plays out, but I would expect to see him play against Kent State and beyond this year. T. Frank, anything else you learned last night that you thought was interesting from James from a either news perspective or looking back perspective? I was glad to hear him point out how poor the tackling was against Bowling Green, because it certainly was a big part of the issue. We didn't maybe talk about it as much post-game. I know we wrote it a couple different places. I'm sure you covered it as well, but that was something that I asked Kobe King after the game and said, how do you, in a world of college football where you don't really tackle in practice, how do you fix that at this point? And he said that they do a lot of simulation stuff and things that he believes, if the fundamentals are followed, will clean. The fundamentals will take care of itself if they are followed and executed.
I'll get into that kind of with our conversation about James Franklin's press conference in between lines in a little bit, because I think it's not just about tackling, it's about who is tackling.
Right. All right, well, let's move into the Penn State practice observations, T. Frank. And obviously it was an evening for us to see Penn State in action. Before we do that, though, should we do a promo?
We can do the promo, but you know how I love my intros. We got an intro for this one as well. But yeah, if you want to get in bluewhiteillustrated.com so you can get this stuff live as it happens, join us now. 2 months for $1. It's an unreal kind of deal, Greg. 2 months for $1 of premium information from bluewhiteillustrated.com. We provide our instant thoughts as we're watching practice on the Blue White Illustrated message board, and then we formulate that into coherent thoughts and sentences that then become our notebooks later. So you get the unedited version, and then you get the edited and curated version later, so you get all of the context over at bluewhiteillustrated.com for practice, so you would be in on this conversation before we talk about it the next day.
All right.
Thank you
Penn
for
State
humoring
practice
me.
update time. Absolutely, buddy. Anytime. Penn State practice update time here on the September 11th edition of the BWI Live Show. T. Frank, we saw a little bit more of practice than we do on a typical week, which has kind of been the way the bye week goes. And so it was obviously individual drills that we always see, fundamental-based stuff. There was some one-on-one work. And the one thing, and I think this is what you mean by your line in the rundown, maybe not, but one thing that stood out to me was they were very intentional about making sure they were getting guys further down the depth chart work with the analyst, who are now allowed to do on-field coaching stuff, which is not something you typically see during a game week.
So what they did is they kind of went back to training camp mode where everyone was wearing their number, as opposed to like a game week where you've got the scout team that is emulating the next opponent. What they did is this week everyone was back to kind of square one, but they did have the developmental squad players down the depth chart working separately on more basic fundamental stuff with the analysts, as opposed to the position coaches who were working with the two deep. So when we talk about the tight end room, and we talk about Luke Reynolds being with the starters, going through practice as the number 2 tight end, Khalil Dinkins being the number 3 guy through the line, Dinkins is still working his way back from an injury. Even if he's available, it doesn't mean that he is at full go. And I think we saw that both in practice during some of the highlights we'll get to, in the one-on-ones that we saw, and of course during the game. Like, he just didn't look like the same guy. So on top of that, you look at the guys they had with the developmental squad. This isn't changing anything, but it is a clear reflection of they have 3 tight ends they want to play right now, where Jerry Cross and Joey Schlaffer were with the developmental squad. So that's an important distinction. Now, if they have to play those guys, they will play those guys, but those players are not in the same group of instruction, even during game week, where they're getting reps in their offense. They are running the other offense, so they're not getting work to necessarily get better at the same level as the A group, essentially. And that kind of held true for the receivers. Offensive line is a little bit different. It was harder to see, but I do believe they had their starting unit versus developmental players, and there was a clear delineation between where Javen Williams and Egan Boyer were, and then the starting tackles and the starting offensive line elsewhere. But they always do that where like half of them are shielding the other half, so it's harder to see with the offensive linemen. The other thing, so that's kind of just set up what type of practice it was on Tuesday.
Yeah, no doubt about it. One thing I want to clean up from the chat: has Franklin indicated that KJ Winston Jr.'s injury is long term? No. He has not. He has not said anything more about it since he spoke on Saturday and said that he was not willing to get into what was going on with KJ Hamler after he missed basically 3/4 of that game. So, no, Winston. It has not been termed KJ Winston, yes. KJ Winston has not been termed a long-term injury at this point in time. So, Penn State, one of the things we saw at practice was the one-on-ones T. Frank talked about, and I'll hit the highlights of those now as we discuss it. And I'm assuming one guy who stood out to you during that was Tysier Denmark. Is that true?
Yeah, so I guess the conversation I wanted to have here is, as opposed to some of those tight ends and the development you can see in some of these things, and this is where Liam Clifford toasts. I mean, that was the win of the day from the one-on-ones, was Liam Clifford's route against Tyrese Mills. The guy that stood out here is Dejon Lane. Quick derailment of my previous point, but Dejon Lane looked really good. You see the potential, you see why the staff is so high on him. Again, Dinkins doesn't look healthy, but Dejon Lane looks very confident going through some of these reps. He got a really good PBU. He was able to keep the ball away from Dinkins. And then the other guy that looked good here was Tysier Denmark. We'll see at the end where, again, he victimizes Tyrese Mills, who kind of struggled in this drill against on a deep route where he caught the ball at the end. Unfortunately, I was like running over, so I only caught the tail end of that particular thing here for the video. But Denmark, it was interesting to note his progress, where during camp in the first 2 weeks of the season, he was with the scout team. He was with the freshmen getting instruction. Now he's with the two deep. So he was with the receivers that were working with Marcus Higgins, the starting quarterbacks, and Andy Konolnicki at that in the A group. So his movement up the depth chart was tangible, and I think for Penn State fans who are excited about that, it's a good step in the right direction. But I'm still wait and see on when he's going to see the field, given just the situation at receiver overall.
Yes. No, me too. And I think that What the most difficult part about that receiver conversation is that I think every time we talk about Tysier Denmark, there's like another indication that he might be the savior for this room. And the receiver room overall, I'm just not ready to make any sweeping conclusions about anything we've seen the first 2 weeks. Obviously, there's been a significant lack of targets for the receivers room. Not necessarily a shock. Also, worth pointing out that Penn State has not run, it's had a lot of explosive drives that have led to quick drives, which of course reduces your play count on offense.
Yeah.
And then there's been some missed throws and drops and things like that have set this offense back from a passing perspective. And oh, by the way, Tyler Warren just set a single game record for number of yards by a tight end in Penn State history for a single game. So
yeah.
I continue to think Denmark could impact this team at some point this year, but just like the rest of the receivers room, you have reason to question why that would or could be the case. He's making positive progress. How quickly does it show up on the game field will be my question.
Yeah, and there's also the aspect of the players he would have to leap in this particular room. And that's really, I guess the point is you do have Liam Clifford who can play inside and out. Caden Saunders has not been healthy, so he has not even seen the field on offense. And through that, Tysier Denmark has not seen the field. What they did is they put Julian Fleming in the slot, and then they played Omari Evans outside. So he has to develop, and they have to feel comfortable with him at some point. But by that point, do you have a full, healthy room, which has 2 slot receivers? And I think Denmark can play outside. I've kind of moved off that point. But is he a guy that you want to play outside over Trey Wallace, Julian Fleming, and Omari Evans? So it's not necessarily, it's just the path to the field. I feel like they have those things set, and he has to be better than veterans in the same way that Luke Reynolds has been better and leapfrogged those players. I think it's just a harder task, despite people's opinion of the Penn State receiver room. I just think that's a harder task right now than in some of the other positions. But that doesn't mean he's not as good of a player as a guy like Luke Reynolds, who, and it might have an impact at some point this season if they continue to have issues at the receiver room, because getting into something later, I still don't think they were healthy at receiver this past weekend.
Yeah, and it's a fair point as well. So we'll have to wait and see there. I've been waiting for the Liam Clifford breakout after he was said to be a away guy during camp with Trey Wallace. Has not happened, but we'll see there. A couple other practice thoughts. I think that, as we talked about earlier, the depth and number crunch at safety and at linebacker, I think, was pretty noticeable when you look out at those groups practicing. It definitely feels like there's just not a lot of guys in either of those lines waiting to go through whatever drill it is they're waiting to go through. Which brings me to, I don't know if this is the right spot for it, T. Frank, but it's come up in the chat so many times, we might as well just address it now. This idea of it's either past time or now time to give up the Abdul Carter defensive end move and move him back to linebacker. And I hate to tell everyone, but it's not going to happen.
Yeah, especially seeing he's playing well at defensive end. Right. And that's something that James Franklin talked about. I don't think we have this one in between the lines. And we'll get to it later, I guess, or we can do it. Yeah, we'll just do it now. He's playing well. James Franklin talked about it. The film said this as well. And I'll give you a stat. In the first half, Connor Bazelak got rid of the football in 2.17 seconds on average. James Franklin talked about they rolled the pocket, they played quick game, they ran the football. They refused to let the Penn State defensive ends or defensive tackles get to the quarterback. Right. Zane Durant, maximum impact for a guy that didn't have any stats because they got rid of the football. That is not on that. That is your defensive personnel and personality affecting the game plan before the other team even steps on the field, where they don't feel like they can take shots downfield. Right. They only feel like they can play in a 10-yard box. It worked for them because Penn State didn't play well, and they didn't force third and longs. But it's not the edge defender's fault, who got free rushes at the quarterback several times, that he gets rid of the football and gets a touchdown because the play is open. When you've got a free rusher and the ball is out in less than 2 seconds, there's only so many ways. You can't just checkmate your way into a sack. And so I think you have to understand the personality of the defense is going to influence the game plan before we even see them execute it. And that is a huge part of Abdul Carter specifically. But at the same time, Greg, I don't see a Chop Robinson level of domination out there because he is still relatively new to the position. So
Right.
both things are true. He's not chopped. They're probably not going to have the same level of impact from that position, but they are getting a facsimile of that right now early on in the season. And I think that's a positive sign.
Yeah, no doubt about that. From the chat, did I read wrong that Carter was talking about moving back if necessary? No, you did not. Our Nate Bauer wrote that at blueillustrated.com following the game that Carter, as you would probably expect, asked about that possibility, said he would do whatever the team needs him to do to play the best defense and try and win. So, I mean, yeah, I think if you expect, he wasn't going to say no, I don't think, even if that is, like, so even if he may have been thinking that, which I don't want to put words in his mouth. But yeah, I just think that you can move him back, but what does it change to your defense? Like, a defensive end has its own numbers crunch going on.
Yeah.
So, and I think you made that move this offseason and you don't panic 2 games in is where I'm at with it at this point.
And you're taking, at that point, what the problem is right now is Tony specifically this past game.
Right.
Tony Rojas was injured for part of the game based on he disappeared and then came back in the third quarter and clearly couldn't take contact. But watching him play, he's not bad at it. He's not great at tackling. Like, he throws a couple shoulders, and the reason he got injured in the game was he came in high instead of coming in low on the running back, and on top of getting washed on the play, like getting just man-tossed aside, he also seemed to suffer some sort of injury, but he came back and played through it. So some of those tackling issues are real, some of those tackling issues are not real, but the point here is he didn't play, and if you move Abdul Carter back to linebacker, you're then moving Tony Rojas from that position, which isn't the problem. The problem is some of those backup linebackers, some of your depth pieces, the veterans that we all know, they struggled to tackle. So I guess, yeah, you could play a 3 linebacker set where you're moving Tony Rojas to the field and Abdul's playing at the will, but that's only against teams that are going to run the football. I would not want to have Abdul Carter against a team that plays a spread offense and is passing. That's just like, you've got to have the matchup where it makes sense for him to play. That is coming. Minnesota's on the schedule. He will play linebacker against Minnesota. I would put a couple of dollars on that just based on my opinion. I don't think there's a lot of teams in the next couple of weeks. Maybe Illinois makes sense, but that's about it.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And James Franklin pretty clear to the point you're making that Penn State wants to be in that 4-2-5.
Hold on.
Go ahead.
The real zeal, he's not getting. If we're talking about Abdul Carter, he's not getting killed in the run game. That is incorrect. And I don't want to. I just want to correct any sort of misinformation out there. This is an incorrect statement to say that he's getting killed in the run game. And if you're talking about Tony Rojas, also that is incorrect. Those things are not true statements.
So Penn State, of course, will continue to use Abdul Carter in a number of ways, but I think the takeaway for us here today is that you're still going to see him more at defensive end, which was the case before the season started and is now. All right, let's get into
they have both gotten reps with runs.
It's Between the Lines time, T. Frank, our weekly look at things James Franklin said and taking them beyond what he said to what they mean. Our first one here, and this came up in the chat, so it's actually perfect timing, is going to be related to technology use. This being the in-home communication where Tom Allen's talking to Kobe King on the field. James Franklin noted on Saturday that it seems like, at least to me, Penn State had some issues with that in the first half at home, obviously with the crowd noise pumping up the Bowling Green, or the defense to take on Bowling Green. Here's what James Franklin had to say on that.
There's some things that we've had to clean up, with the technology about what is best for Penn State in using the technology on the defensive side of the ball and at home. What are the best ways to use that, whether we're using the mic system and some of the things that you got to work through by doing that, especially at home with the noise. I think that factored in.
So, number one, it was not loud at Beaver Stadium at all during the first half of that game, beyond the booing of the offense and at times the defense. So, I didn't quite follow that. In the second half, I could have understood it, and maybe it was both. I don't know.
Was the communication just not working? Because It was in the first half. This also explains why a lot of times in the first half I felt like they were not prepared for the snap. Like they were either looking to the sideline, unsure of what was going on, or straight up standing up at the snap. That makes sense if it wasn't working. But the volume thing I thought was interesting because if that's the case, why aren't we having this conversation about the offense on the road after week 1?
Right. Yeah, I wondered the same thing, and I don't want to make any great big assumptions here. Clearly something was not right communication-wise on the field, and that in part was because it was not good on the sideline. And we weren't able to ask a follow-up with James Franklin, so whether the in-helmet communication was not working, whether maybe Tom Allen's if you listen to him, he has not much of a voice, so he may not have.
I thought about that too. Yeah.
He may have been just hard to hear. There's any number of possibilities, but it certainly came off to me, T. Frank, listening to James Franklin talk, that they had some issues that they were not expecting with this. So to the question on the chat, I'm not going to find it here. I think, that's okay. Here we go. Something I don't understand with the tablets and helmet communication and Tom Allen on the sideline. Why wait until halftime to make adjustments? So if the issue was Kobe King hearing Tom Allen, that is probably something that you would need some more time to fix than just a series or two, for whatever reason it might be.
Yeah.
Or you might be trying different things to try and solve that issue. And again, I don't know. I'm just speculating here because he wasn't asked a follow-up. But
yeah,
could they have fixed it sooner? Yeah. I mean, I think that's always the case, right? I think James Franklin a lot of times will point out.
I don't think they wanted to.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, I'm not sure. But something was not working that they were able to overcome against Bowling Green. And must ensure that won't be an issue moving forward.
I would go back to the point of they did not play well. So the coaches may have made the determination that if we just play better, what we're doing will work. Because there are certain things, and again, I broke this down this past weekend. It's buried in like 200 replies because I break down almost every single play on the Blue White Illustrated message board from every game. It's a lot of information. But they were not playing well on the D-line specifically. There were some techniques that they were doing incorrectly. The tackling was also part of the conversation. And that's part of making adjustments on the fly. They didn't change a whole lot in the second half. Now, they did, but when they played the things they played in the first half, they just did them better in the second half. So I still have the open-ended question of, are they specifically only playing a couple of coverages and a couple of situations to not get into some of their other things? Or is this the defense they want to be this year? If it's the second part, I have an issue with that. If it's the first part, then I can't, we don't know the full plan going into every game. We don't know the full plan for the season. So there are open-ended questions of, did you do things intentionally to obscure what you want to do in the long term? And that's just something I don't have an answer to.
Right. Another comment James Franklin made on the defense was the moving parts that the team is dealing with. Let's listen to what he had to say on that.
And then, we had a couple bumps and bruises, so we had some moving parts that caused us some issues on defense and on special teams. But obviously the bye week came at a really good time to kind of spend some time working through some of these things, get some things cleaned up. But I think the biggest issue is we didn't tackle as well.
Penn State, Steve Frank, certainly did not tackle as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, those things are all connected. You lose KJ Winston, your best tackler, bar none. He is now not as an extra fixer in the run game to come and clean things up. That role falls to Jalen Reed, who is a good football player and does those things. But when you had both of those guys essentially converging from either side of the pocket, that is different than having them only one of them on the field.
Yes, correct. There's no doubt about that. And when you combine that, T. Frank, with the fact that and we may have lost T. Frank, I'm not sure, or he's just taking a quick break. Never mind. All right.
Yep, I'm here. Battery died. This is what happens when you have an inoptimal studio setup.
All right. Well, let me filibuster so you can get caught back up here. But I thought James Franklin, one thing he said on that clip, obviously the tackling is something I pointed out earlier in the show, that was not good. And you make a good point as to why that was the case. But then when you hear him say at one point yesterday that they have issues with the defensive rep count being too high, it is. There's no doubt about that. After 2 weeks, it is. they have struggled at times to get off the field, and between that and the number of guys that they rotated a lot at West Virginia. Let's not forget about that. They rotated, especially in the first half before the lovely weather delay. They rotated a lot of guys, and they weren't really able to do that, or at least not the way they wanted to do that against Bowling Green, because they struggle good off the field. Penn State ranks 90th in the country. It's giving up 40% of its opponent third downs, which is not very good. Not something Penn State was troubled by a year ago. Some of the defensive stats, T. Frank, so far are pretty ugly. There's just kind of no way to slice it. I mean, there are some ugly stats, some of which were related to the fact that Bowling Green had a good game plan to sort of neutralize the Penn State pass rush. But certainly, we went into this year saying how hard it would be for Tom Allen to keep this Penn State defense toward the top of the national leaderboards in a number of categories. And look, it's 2 games in. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. But some early season indicators that need to be cleaned up. There's no question about that.
Yeah, and I guess I kind of said my piece on these things, and I don't want to beat this. I don't want to beat this horse to death when it comes to. I just haven't seen Tom Allen's defense. I haven't seen Manny Diaz's defense. I'm not saying they just said come in and be Manny despite everything they said, but it is somewhere in between. And right now, the decision-making process of how to do that, plus I think some instability at linebacker. We knew the depth wasn't going to be great. We know they want to cycle players in, and they trust Tyler Elsdon and Dom DeLuca, I think, more than fans do. But there is no doubt some of those players have to play better. Dom DeLuca is not having the lights-out performance he did when he was a rotational player last year. There were some critical losses from him, but overall, he made impact plays. He is more vulnerable in ways I wasn't expecting from a discipline standpoint so far, and that has to change because they're going to need him specifically to play this year. And I'm not trying to single any player out, but when you lose a starter for part of the time and you lose your star safety and like you're down some players, guys have to step up and not just be a rotational player, but then ascend into actually being a difference maker. And so that's part of the conversation here. And that's, I think that's this week specifically, but if these things linger, it's a long-term thing. We know the depth at linebacker isn't great. So somebody has to start playing better outside of the top 2.
That's correct. T. Frank, let's get to our last clip from James Franklin talking about fittingly a good transition here because we just did so a little bit. Third down issues.
The biggest thing to me is third down. And the reason I say that is it really goes hand in hand with all of our things that we need to get cleaned up on offense. So what I mean by that is back to the first half, right? Our defense, there's extended drives. Our offense is not. We're either scoring or going 3 and out a lot of times. So what happens is the play count is out of whack. We're not getting enough plays. You've heard me talk about balance. Part of balance is not just running and being able to throw the ball in every situation. It's spreading the field 53 1/3. It's also getting touches for guys. We don't have enough opportunities to get enough guys touches because we're not sustaining drives. Defensively, we've got to get off the field. Our rep count is way up right now on defense, and our rep count needs to be higher on offense. We get 10 more plays in the first half. We don't have a hold on third down, and we convert that third down, or we don't drop the ball on third down. That may equal another 6 plays.
Penn State, T. Frank, 7 of 20 to start the season on third down on offense.
Yeah, but I think this past game, there's 2 points that I want to make based off of what he said there. The first is they are converting those third downs. They're just being called back. So I take it as a positive that it wasn't a throwaway on third down. Drew Aller complete those third downs he talked about. Drew Aller completed those passes. One was called back for a holding. That was a phantom call, essentially, when you watch it back and what actually happened. And then it's a drop on a wide open target that hits the receiver in the face mask. So the offensive scheme worked. The blocking worked well enough, even though I think there were some issues there. And then the quarterback threw the ball perfectly. If I get 3/4 of that and the next time we just need the receiver to catch the football, you can change the receiver that's targeted, and you can also, that receiver cannot drop it the next time. So some of these third down issues, Trey Wallace on a 54-yard bomb or whatever it was, that was an on-target pass. Those are the things that I come away from this game feeling positive about, despite the fact that they had some issues converting, because as James Franklin talked about, we can get into this this is the transition between now and the film study. Is one of the reasons Liam Clifford and Julian Fleming don't have targets is they don't have enough snaps to get them targets to establish those credible threats that other teams have to prepare for. That's what he's talking about, of creating threats in the mind of future defensive coordinators. They aren't doing that from a comprehensive standpoint, but it's not from a lack of execution by the important things, the big cogs in the machine. I think these details can get worked out, as opposed to last year when it's like, well, nobody's open, and that's a problem. Guys are open, players are working. There's just been focus or injury, penalty, whatever the issue is that is preventing it from fully translating, and those things can improve, as opposed to some systemic issues that I don't think they're facing right now.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. And I think that if you want to look at it glass half full, those plays that go against you early in the year usually have a way of going for you later in the year. Things even out. Not always, but a lot of times. So I think there's that. I think you make a fair point on the holding call. And I think you have to believe in Andy Kotelnicki. Now, one thing James Franklin did say, which was also part of the problem, is that they had a lot of plays, or drives rather, where they got off schedule. And that's a lot.
Yep.
Well, most of the time it was because of first or second down run plays.
Yeah.
That did not create much, and that was an issue for Penn State when those drives where they went 3 and out. And then, on the other side of it, though, is that you'll take 7 points any way you can get them. I understand that, you're saying that Penn State is either – I understand what he's getting at when he says it's either 3 and out or a, explosive touchdown, but take them when you can get them. And you see how the plays, figure that out.
But even the running game is working.
Along.
So I would say even the running game is working, where it's not just explosive plays. You've got Nick Singleton generating positive yardage on 5 and 6 yard runs or 9 yard runs. So it's not like it's boom or bust in the run game. It's just in certain situations where the other team is selling out to stop the run, they're not winning with 9 guys in the box. Is in some of those situations, that's how, from a schematic standpoint, it worked out. You would like to see maybe a different play call, but at the same time, they had like 11 guys in the box, and Nick Singleton broke off a touchdown. So it's a result-based thing than over a process-based thing when you're making some of those criticisms about the play calling. So I always tread lightly on some of those ideas. But you're right. Like, you would like those in 4-minute situations to not go 3 and out, and they did, and that is not a great. That no matter what. End of the story. It's a results-based business. You cannot go 3 and out when you just got the football and you need to close out a MAC opponent.
Right. No doubt about that. All right, let's get into, we're going to cover some of this stuff and some other new topics in our final segment of the day, the Sunday film study. T. Frank, I know you went through a lot of the clips from the first 2 weeks, and obviously specifically Bowling Green, but we just talked about running the ball, and I know we're going to lead this segment off with Nick Singleton. So I should probably see if we can get Nate in just for this portion of the show. I should buzz him real quick while you kick off.
I've got the Nate was right intro, and that's all we need.
That's all we need, yes. So give me your evaluation of Nick so far.
A complete evolution from Nick Singleton. Complete and total evolution into a complete tailback so far. That is so important. I'm seeing a blend of maturity, creativity at this point, lateral explosive ability to evade players in the backfield, things that we fundamentally questioned if he was capable of. He is now producing those plays against bad defenses. Some of this conversation is going to be about these were some not great defenses from both a scheme and talent perspective, but even against bad defenses last year, we saw Nick Singleton treat every situation like he's a hammer and it's a nail, and we saw better vision from him. You mentioned that touchdown to end the game. The point of attack was clogged. There was the intended run scheme didn't work, and he, instead of panicking or whatever he would do in that situation, I don't want to say panic, but like just make the decision to run into the hole anyway, he stayed patient. And what happened was, because he was patient, the defense lost track of him. They didn't know where he was. So if you go back and watch it, the Will linebacker, number 3, their best defender, is literally doing this. And Nick Singleton's gone. Like, he's behind him at that point. That's Nick Singleton. He is 100% responsible for that touchdown. That is not the Nick Singleton we saw the last 2 years. There's another play where I think it was Sal Wormley didn't get his block, and he's trapped in the backfield for what would have been normally a negative 3-yard play. There's a defensive tackle that has him squared up. He stays patient. He stays calm in the moment. He cuts back around that guy and has a, I don't want to call it Saquon Barkley, but Saquon Barkley-esque run where it was a negative 2-yard play that he made 4 yards out of. And then, of course, him as a receiver. If you want to see some of these things, by the way, at Thomas Frank Carr on Twitter, I broke these plays down for everyone to see. I go into more detail on the website, but those are important plays to me where it doesn't matter if it's Bowling Green or not. The process of how he created those plays, the touchdown where he catches the ball way more naturally than I've seen him catch the ball before, runs a really good route. These are critical developments that we needed to see from him, and he has killed it the first 2 weeks. If you've got a first-round running back, which is how he's playing right now, and a first-round quarterback, that's it. That's what Penn State fans have been begging for 2 years.
Right. Correct. And they now have it, or at least the makings of it, of course. As Penn State sits 2 weeks into the season. Speaking of that, 2 weeks in, Penn State as a offense has 25 pass receptions. Only 10 of them are to receivers. One of them's to Julian Fleming for 3 yards. None of them are registered to Liam Clifford. Any initial thoughts on the role those two have had in the offense so far? If you want to make this overarching about the receivers, fine, but just those two in particular, your initial learnings from watching back the tape.
They are not the primary targets in the game plan. Right. So that is to everyone's question of the hype of Julian Fleming, and is he the number one target in this offense? He is not. We've been trying to tell you that all offseason. So if you're coming into that and that's your criticism here, like, you're not listening to what we've been saying, which is why you got to subscribe, because we've broken this down in detail, painful, excruciating detail for 8 months. Yeah. Liam Clifford, I am still convinced, is not healthy. He was not healthy last week. He played more snaps, but he was not involved in the game plan and how they were attacking the secondary. So let's talk about these two. This is kind of the overarching point of the Bowling Green game and what I expected out of West Virginia to start. Both of these teams like to play 2 deep safeties and keep a lid on explosive plays, but it's a very bendable and breakable defense that Andy Kotelnicki has proven time and time again. He knows how to shred this particular style of defense. To do that, you put your best athletes in the slot, whether from motion or formation, and have them run deep against safeties. Julian Fleming or Amari Evans, which one has a better speed advantage against a safety?
Evans.
Tyler Warren against a safety. Which one has a better size advantage than Julian Fleming over a safety? So if you're crafting an offense to defeat cover 4, to defeat quarters, a Big 12 style of defense, it's not going to be Julian Fleming or an unhealthy Liam Clifford who might not be at 100%. So Amari Evans gets a lot of targets. And here's the question, and I asked this yesterday. Let's say he catches that big touchdown where he pushed off, and he ends the game with 3 catches, or let's just say he doesn't drop. Let's go best case scenario. He has over 100 yards.
Right.
And he's a 100-yard receiver, and you have Tyler Warren as a 100-yard receiver in the game. We don't necessarily, it doesn't matter. It's the fact that the receivers dropped the football and a bunch of plays were called back in that game that changes the perception on the box score. But these guys were getting open against Bowling Green, and they were getting open against West Virginia. But when West Virginia plays more man coverage and single high safety, where there are more one-on-one opportunities, Trey Wallace is your guy. When they play a team that takes away Trey Wallace and focuses on Amari Evans, and they leave Julian Fleming alone, that's establishing threats. That's establishing the threats you need to stop. Because Tyler Warren had 1 catch, or 2 catches, I think, in the game against West Virginia, because they triple-teamed him at times. When Fleming has the opportunity to play in his natural position, where he didn't play the first week, against a team that gives him the opportunity, he will get the football. They are not discriminating against anybody. It's just he's not the primary target on a lot of these plays. He's doing a lot of the dirty work, which when you had guys last year who were not running hard through clear-out routes and were not being selfless teammates on plays where they were not the intended primary target, That's one of the problems with that offense last year. They have a selfless receiving core that is doing all of those things this year.
No doubt about that. Let's move over to the defensive side of the ball for our next film study conversation. We hit on these two earlier, so I'll lump them together and you can go any direction you want. But Abdul Carter and the idea that he's not making an impact, and then Tony Rojas, the tackler, and what kind of issues or things you see on tape from those two guys after 2 weeks.
He has some Tony Rojas has some highlight misses when it comes to his tackling, and I'm not going to try and defend that. But after he got hit in the chest by a shoulder because he had a little bit of poor tackling for him, he couldn't take on contact the same way in the second half. So this is more about the way he played, and I was impressed with his ability to still be an impact player because he got some defensive stops in those situations when he couldn't take on stack and shed offensive linemen. And he was still able to dip under. It reminded me of Ellis Brooks. Do you remember a couple years ago, Ellis Brooks, like against, I think it was Iowa, broke his thumb or had some sort of hand injury. He couldn't use his hands, so he just dipped under every single block and got a bunch of tackles for loss or got a bunch of important stops against that team as the team's middle linebacker. It reminded me of that. So I was just impressed with this is a sophomore who knows how to overcome situations and still make an impact, including a game-sealing interception. And his coverage ability is a difference-making strength of this defense. I think they can do a lot of things that they're not doing right now because Tony is a special coverage defender from that linebacker role. So there's a lot of good stuff. And then Abdul Carter had a bunch of free pressures. And we'll talk about this with, really, this is Zane Durant too. So it's all lumped together.
Yeah.
A lot of guys that did not have stats in the game had very good games because of the game plan from Bowling Green. Zane Durant had the maximum impact he could have for a guy with no stats. He had one tackle. But there were plays where he blew up the run concept and somebody else got the tackle. There were plays where he got an immediate win and the quarterback threw the ball away. So he's having the start of the season you want from a guy that can be a difference maker on the interior. He's just going to be rewarded with those stats at a later date, you would hope. And again, with Abdul Carter, same thing of his impact as a run defender. Somebody in the chat, our information about he was getting blown up in the run game. Was there a play where he got pushed off the line of scrimmage by a tackle and a tight end on a pin and pull? Yeah, there was. There was also a play where he dented the run game and was great against the run. He was great against Wyatt Milam on the road. Overall, his play against the run has been better than the negatives so far. So anyone can have a low light reel that looks terrible. But if you don't go through the process of seeing the complete picture, then you're trying to confirm a prior observation or a prior belief. I came in thinking he was not going to be good against the run and not be an all-around player, and he has exceeded those expectations. So I'm in on Abdul Carter and his impact as a complete defensive end.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And I think that's, again, why you'll see him continue to play that role much more, if not solely, compared to possibly sliding back to linebacker. A couple of programming notes as we wind down this edition of the BWI Live Show. We have the BWI Live Recruiting Show coming up on Thursday, September 12th. We'll have a wrestling show this week. So I know somebody in the chat was asking about the Carter Starachi, AJ Ferrari situation. Stay tuned for that a little bit later in the week.
I got to learn about that this week.
You did? Yes. Yeah, we had a good conversation about that. That's teasing, either foreshadowing or whatever you want to call it. And we'll have it up later this week. And then obviously I hope everyone enjoys their bye week. T-Frank, any final thoughts as we close out this edition of the BWI Live Show? Not football. Just we're if you didn't see, Fitz was not on the show on Tuesday. I don't know if he'll be on the show on Thursday. Some stuff that he's working through on his own, some family stuff. Don't want to get into any of that, but we're just thinking of him. So that's really the main thing other than, football is it may just be Ryan and me on the show tomorrow. So that's just kind of a programming note. And then of course, hope you enjoy our conversation about these things. Hopefully we, have brought you what you were looking for on the bye week, which was surprisingly spicy, Greg. Yes. I was not expecting this to have as much to talk about. But overall, I'll just reiterate this. I'm positive generally about the execution of Penn State football's plan offensively and defensively. I think they've got enough talent and enough special players.
that I'm optimistic they can battle with everybody as long as they're healthy. And that's the biggest question to me is, are they going to be healthy enough to overcome teams that are better on their schedule?
It's a good question, and it's one we won't have answered this week, but it's one that we will continue to talk about both at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, here on the BWI YouTube channel, and wherever you get your audio. One final thing.
Sorry, totally forgot to say this. I'm going to be breaking down, I think, Illinois this weekend on our Sunday film study. There's no opponent, but I still want to get everyone in the rhythm. Hey, every Sunday we're breaking something down. So we're going to be looking at Illinois and how they've played so far this year, because that's the next big opponent everyone's curious about. So advanced scouting. We're not taking this weekend off. We're going to make sure that you're ready to go for Big Ten football with some USC stuff and some Illinois stuff.
Alrighty, that's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle. Join us, BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, and multiple times a week here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel. We will talk to you again here on Thursday and talk to all of you again on Wednesday next week. Have a good day, everyone.